Um, my name is Rui Martins. We are going to speak with Iain Walker. Iain Walker is the Executive Director of the New Democracy Foundation in Australia. The foundation acts as a bridge between academic research and the elected MPs to the Parliament to advocate, fund and operate practical trial of innovations in democracy. Iain holds a Master in Public Policy from the University of Sydney and the Bachelor of Business Marketing from UTS. His career spanned for several commercial roles in the professional sport, in the PGA Tour and Golf Australia, and some time in technology industry at Microsoft Australia. Hi Iain. Good evening. I must spell correctly your name. Okay. Because there is a
yes, absolutely.
In the middle. Oh, I see.
Scottish heritage.
When I searched your name in the Google Plus, I did find several people from Scotland. Now I understand why. Okay, it's
everyone in Australia comes from somewhere
and many
else.
are coming from Portugal because we have a very strong community there.
Absolutely. Near my home, actually. Very near my home. There's a suburb called Petersham and is known as Little Portugal in Sydney.
One of those communities, I think. Well, Iain, we are going to start with our small interview. My first question to you is that the foundation, New Democracy Foundation. Are you a private or public organization? And what are the main objectives of the New Democracy? Can you explain that?
Absolutely. So in short, we are a private foundation. Our main donor is someone who for many years was asked for political donations, and in around about 2005 he had enough. At one of those fundraising dinners he said, "I'll write you one more check, but something needs to change." And amazingly the politicians at that table said, "I think you'll write the check anyway and nothing will change." It was just the wrong thing to say to someone who was motivated to do something a bit different. Luca then sought out well, what's an organisation that works in innovations in democracy and trying to achieve reform. And in Australia, he didn't find anyone. And he approached the University of Sydney, who started him down the path of looking at deliberative democracy. And he said, "This is fantastic. Where is it being trialled?" And it turns out that I think the main focus of many universities is producing papers rather than running hard trials with government. And he realised that was the hole that needed to be filled. So we're a private foundation. Our second largest sponsor donor, I should say, is actually Google, who support democracy initiatives around the world. And with that, what we do is when we approach MPs, our main day-to-day work is to look at situations where there is very low trust in the decision. Frequently that's around tax and revenue or crime or property development, any one of those areas where by definition you either get a vox pop response, and by that I mean people take what's in the headlines rather than looking at the detail of the information, or we just are now conditioned to not accept what our politicians are saying and we automatically distrust them. And where that's the case, we try to show an alternate way of doing things, but our condition for getting involved is that there's genuine authority. So the Parliament says we will pre-agree how we will take notice of this and how we will act on it. So we try to do about 2 projects a year and show MPs that there is a way that they can innovate and get a different outcome. And the positive thing is at all tiers of government, so state, local and federal in Australia, we're finding MPs are actually very responsive to this. So that is the short version of what we try to do here at the foundation.
And you are happy with the efficiency of your work? Is it really changing something? Do you feel that?
In short, yes. We've gone from, I think when you take on a job like this, one of your first questions is, I wonder if anyone will talk to us. And the first groups of people that we spoke to, it was obviously we were starting from scratch. Why we are able to make a difference is because of the organisational structure that we've created. We have a research committee, so like a secondary board that comprises former premiers of our largest states. So, and they come from both sides of politics. If you were to ask someone from the left of politics in Australia who is a premier you very much respect, many people would say Jeff Gallop. And even those on the other side of politics would respect what he achieved a great deal. Equally, for those on the right, there's a Premier of New South Wales, our largest state, called Nick Greiner, and even those on the left would respect what he achieved. By getting former premiers from both sides of politics to lend their support, and very active support, they've been willing to pick up the phone to current premiers to help us get the chance to make our point and deliver our message. That sends, firstly, it sends a very clear message that we're non-partisan, because they're not two people you would naturally see lining up on any other issue. It sends a very clear message that people who have been there and done that are now saying, with my time again, I would use deliberative processes. I would use, take advantage of the capacity of everyday citizens rather than doing things the way that we've always done them. So in terms of the impact we're being able to make, we started out doing projects for local government with mayors. We've done a project for the state parliament, and what we've seen is the media outlets from the left of spectrum to the right all are saying, wow, look at the really insightful and trustworthy decisions juries of everyday people are able to reach. With that, we've found the people who want to be in contact with us multiply. So there are more mayors, and increasingly there are more current state premiers. We could start to see the tiers of elected politicians choosing to get in touch. We're moving up the food chain, and that simply comes from success in terms of the results of the work, but also comes from success in terms of the way it's been received by the media. It's seen as a trusted mechanism to use a deliberative process using randomly selected juries of citizens.
That's very interesting, because most of the people believe that all the matters related to the participatory and the direct democracy are more positioned to the left than to the right. And it's very curious to hear you saying that you can connect to the people on the right side of the political spectrum also.
I think the way to approach that, and it's a great question, is that with the groups on the left who may have a position, and we are very, hopefully no one gets a sense of whether I lean left, right, or forwards or backwards, but we simply have no view. For the people on the left, we do take the point of view that a jury of everyday citizens gets beyond the perceived corporate power that many people perceive, the mistrust of significant amounts of money. For the people on the right, we do make the point that their main ideology tends to be about the capacity of individuals to make their own decisions in life. This simply empowers individuals. So we look at a deliberative process as really, it doesn't ideologically fall one way or another. I agree with you that it has in the past, mainly because it originates from academia, which in Australia at least, people who work in universities tend to be more left-leaning, so it gets that perception. And that's why we've quite deliberately got people you may not naturally expect to be associated. One of our other supporters, for anyone who cares to have a look at our website, is the Chief Executive of the Business Council of Australia. Now, the Business Council is the association of the Chief Executives of the 100 largest firms, who have made the point that we can lobby for change, but nobody will trust it. We think that the facts of the matter are self-evident, so we're going to start advocating for certain issues to be handled in processes you design, and we can live with the results that come out, because our current method of advocacy, either it doesn't work, or when it does work and you get your way, no one trusts the results. So the current mode of making public decisions maybe doesn't work quite as well as it used to, and that's just a function of time. people understand how the political system works now, and all systems change over time as people start to realise what are the main things that make a difference.
Yes, you are right. It is very curious because we are organizing a campaign in the local level. We are going to advance to Lisbon in the elections that are going to take place this year. And some minutes ago, I did say to the group that the direct democracy is much more methodology than an ideology. And we can have on the same group people from different spectrums of the political range, from left to right, because it's much more a way of doing things than a way to point to the directions. But let's proceed to the questions that I have.
If I could just jump in on that, Rui, if I may.
Yes,
I think the point of challenging people's thinking that I'd love to leave behind today is to weigh up, do we want direct democracy or do we want a deliberative democracy? There tends to be a focus on direct democracy. You can let 200,000 people, 1 million people have a say on an issue, but that might be a say like an opinion poll. It may be just I've had a look and I click because it's a very instantaneous response. And one of the points that we'd like to weigh up is we trust juries of people, just 12 people, to look at all the evidence in a murder trial and decide if someone gets locked up for 25 years. Can we start trusting, or very long time, can we start looking at some of our public decisions and saying, well, we take the same model, we take a jury of just 40 or 50 people, but instead of asking them just to make a very quick response in an online direct democracy model, instead we say we're actually going to give you 5 or 6 months. We're going to give you access to all the information that our elected decision makers would have, and let's see what result that gets to. And what we've found, because we did this for an inquiry about renewable energy for the state parliament here in New South Wales, is that function of time and information can be very transformative. Now, on what is a very highly charged topic in Australia, there would be no more controversial topic than energy futures. Australia sits on an enormous amount of coal and gas and non-renewable energy sources. What we found is that two juries of people, one in regional New South Wales, one in our capital city, actually reached a unanimous set of recommendations. When everyday people who've clearly consumed a lot of information can reach that point, that carries quite a lot of weight with the Parliament, and we also saw it carried weight with the press, and amazingly, it actually carried weight with the energy industry, who looked at it and said, there are things in there that we'd never thought of or hadn't thought to ask for, and yet we could live with them. We could absolutely see that as a solution. And that's what we see as making a positive impact. But I would ask people looking at change to weigh up direct democracy with hundreds of thousands of people and say maybe that God of large numbers is a false God. Maybe what we really want is a deliberative process. So it's a sample, it's a random sample of just everyday people, but we give them time and information.
That's the Demarchy model, aren't you thinking about that? The Demarchy?
So as a foundation, we advocate any innovation that can be more representative and less adversarial. Now, within Demarchy, we see that as a specific solution for local government, in as much as we can. Demarchy essentially says you take that same jury model, and instead of having one government of 12 councillors or 50 government MPs or representatives responsible for everything, because government's so large, we should fragment it down into tiny segments. So in a local government context, you would have juries just for the parks, just for garbage, just for filling potholes, juries just for childcare. And you start to say, the Demarchy concept is to say, can I just start to have revolving juries? And that doesn't answer to an elected group at all. Now, generally when we say that, the notion of taking something away from an elected group can be met with gasps and shock. Now, all we'd ask people to consider is that democracy is not the exercise of a vote, of you writing a 1 on a ballot paper. Democracy is an expression of the general will, and using samples of people, we tend to get a more diverse representation, and we do tend to get a better expression of the general will that is not subject to perceptions of distrust. And I think the people are conditioned to distrust elected representatives, and most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, it is entirely unfair. It is a thankless position where whatever decision you take, those who it benefits won't say anything, and though half dozen people who lose out will make a huge amount of noise and complaint. So we have an imbalance in our decision structure already with that. So we are conditioned to say we're not trying to go out and bash politicians on the head. We respect that it's hard and say, well, instead of complaining, we're coming to your door with solutions. And let us run this process, see if it builds public trust, and if it does, commit to do something with it. And we find that it's a reasonable request of representatives, most of whom are very interested in this kind of topic.
In fact, the Demarchy is very, very interesting. As far as I understand, it doesn't require an election. It's some kind of making the crowdsourcing of voice from a sample from the society. So there are no elections at all. The people are selected by a random process, right?
Correct, and that's a case. Think of them as juries. We don't seem to require that we vote for people on juries, but we trust that it's people like us. Isn't that what we're looking for in getting representatives? You know, think of the actual word representative. It should be indicative of the people. Now, what we see with the election process is a lot of people are put off by it. It takes a certain personality type to contest and run for office because it's hard. It's highly combative. As a generalization, but I need to work with something, people from engineering backgrounds, people from technology backgrounds tend not to get involved in that kind of process.
Lawyers.
In many areas, yeah, and it's look, it can be loud and pushy people like me who it is better suited to, but with sampling, we get everyone. We did a local government process, and through pure sampling and simply asking, are you available for 5 Saturdays? You know, we need 50 hours of your time. But the final sample comprised people from heads of School of Engineering through to childcare workers, through to a lady in public housing, a lady who is completely blind, who would love to get involved, but on an ongoing basis finds things too hard. But with the finite commitment we offered, found it really approachable and digestible. We had people who had chief financial officer within their business. Again, would never give the time commitment to run for council, but given a clearly defined opportunity, it's 5 Saturdays, this is what you'll be deciding, giving them a clear path to authority provided a motivation for a very diverse group of people to get involved. And I think if you look at what are the hard challenges, I hear people mention the word corruption, and what I hear is distrust. There'll always be some level of corruption that really occurs, but equally, we can see some decisions, and in Australia at least, we will look at the decision and say, someone must have had a mate, someone must have had a connection. That's not always the case, but we distrust it. With a jury-style process, if I think of a 50-story building getting built in downtown Lisbon, if I told you that building, that 100 everyday people had looked at the plans for the site and had decided this was good for the city, are you more likely to trust that than hearing that the mayor signed off on it? Every day, I think I would look at the jury and say, oh, if they looked at it in detail and weighed everything up, then I can probably live with that. Hearing the mayor announce it, not that I know that person, but hearing the mayor announce it would be a case where you think, oh, gee, is that the right fit for our city? I'm not sure. There must be something going on. We infer corruption sometimes when both groups of people could reach exactly the same decision.
Yes. Well, yeah. We are speaking about these new tools and these new ways of restoring democracy because the democracy is not in a very good shape currently. So I must ask you, what do you believe that there are, which are the biggest questions, biggest menaces that are placed into the democracy that we have currently on the West?
I think if you look at, and I can only look at what happens in Europe from a very great distance here in Sydney, but if you have two candidates running for election, and one candidate running says, I think we're in a little bit of trouble and everyone has to pay 2% more tax, and the other candidate says everything's fine and we can all retire at 30 years old and everything will be free. That second candidate does very well. Now, that's our natural response to things. Now, that is a challenging environment where if you got a smaller group of voters and said, let's not just respond quickly, there's a natural emphasis in democracy that encourages elected representatives not to fix things. You can always push problems into the future. And all the processes we've run with everyday citizens, they tend to take a very long-term view because they know they'll be paying for it in the end. In the local government process that we did, it's very common for a local government council in Australia to cover its operating costs but not be refreshing its assets, roads, stormwater drains, seawalls. What we saw is that people took it on and said, we've worked out when we saw all the financials, we spoke to people in the area, we started to see that you're not covering all your capital costs. What's the amount of money we really need to pay to cover this? Now, we hadn't set where this would lead to. People can choose to just have bumpier roads. It's fine. But the decision they made was actually to raise their own council rates because they valued a higher quality of service. It wasn't unanimous, but 31 out of 32 people in the room agreed that it was the right way to go. Being able to return that to a council and saying across 4.5 months, this is the reasoned view that your citizens got to. And I'll give you one example of a decision. This particular area has 146 parks and play areas and playgrounds, and they are beautiful. They are absolutely. They look like a perfect football pitch for a very expensive club, and the citizens love them. In a deliberative process, they saw what it cost to provide them to that standard. Said we can't believe we spend $1.4 million mowing the parks. They're mowed every 2 weeks. This is too much. So their recommendation, because they wanted to pay for roads and infrastructure, their recommendation was start mowing them every 3 weeks instead of every 2 weeks. We can live with the grass being that much longer. To the elected representatives, they said, well, no one's ever come to us and said, cut the parks less. Democracy is not geared to trade-offs. Democracy is geared to the candidate who says, I will cut the parks every day. And that's why we tend to get imbalances between that which is visible and that which is spend immediate money on, that which is invisible, and that can range from seawalls that I just described, but it can range through to disadvantaged communities. It can range of homeless groups. A great example of it becomes an area of invisibility. That's where we see there's an imbalance in a system of voting that rewards doing large, visible things. Balancing the books, perhaps, as we've seen there's an issue in Europe, tends to be not something that people can vote for if the alternative is that you're offered something shiny and new. Citizens are capable of getting past that. We just need to provide a democratic structure and one which people trust, that you can just see on face value and say, I trust that. If we can provide those two things, then that's a better way of making public decisions.
And if they participate, they will normally be much more wise that normally is expected. It is curious because there is a recent study made in Switzerland where an academic proves that the democracy applied in Switzerland produces much more savings than expenses. So it's not a so popular way of holding the things that some people may expect. By the way, there is something that I did have some questions on your side. You seem to defend a deliberative process instead of the adversarial process. Can you be more specific about this opposition?
Certainly. So we look at why do we have an adversarial process in government in I think almost all Western countries, where you have a government and an opposition. I think, and the thing, what has informed us as a foundation is that's purely a function of the electoral system. That is what has been magnified. That if the government announces policy A, then it's simply not good politics for the opposition to say, that's fantastic, we do exactly the same thing. Even if they sincerely believe that, it doesn't make sense under the electoral system. That's adversarialism. To actually start to say that you have to differ to create a point of difference so that you're reinforcing your own vote, that you're creating a point of difference. Statistically, any government will make some good decisions. But we very rarely see an opposition ever say, actually, on this issue, the government's got it very right and we respect that. And that's not because oppositions are bad people, that's because you would be very, very stupid to do such a thing. If you or I, or any of the people watching this, were running for office, I would do exactly the same thing. Whatever was announced, you should say, gee, this is going to be a disaster. Because people remember the announcement. There's always I think there's a legal statement that says people remember the accusation far more than they remember the apology. And the same truism holds true. What we see in a deliberative process is that if you take a group of 20 or 30 people, they don't naturally fall into two factions. And in the deliberative process, even if you have across your bell curve of the community, even if you have a couple of people at each end, a deliberative process doesn't simply put 30 people in a room and let them fight like cats in a sack. We tend to see small groups of 4 and 5 discuss an issue, and then we ask that table to report back, and we continually mix the groups up. So what we get away from is there's no notion of one side against another side.
But these people are experts, or they are not no experts on that field?
No. It's everyday people. And let me tell you why this works. There's a writer called Scott Page who wrote a book called The Difference. It's been written up, referred to by a number of authors, including Helen Landemore from Yale University. And essentially it's called diversity theory. And the test is this. What they found is if you take 4 experts on a given topic, and you take 4 people of roughly equivalent education and ask them to solve the same problem, experts can become quite conditioned in that there is only one traditional way to solve the problem, and I fear what my peers will say of me if I divert from the one best way of doing things. If you take everyday people, it's not that they know how to solve the problem, but the first thing they do is ask for advice. And they ask for advice without the fear of what is the one traditional way that we do things. And so the original research on this was, I believe, on oil pipeline design, that an oil pipeline engineer would always design it the same way, whereas a group of people would simply look at the problem of, well, how do I move oil from the site to the market and take it from there? Maybe a pipeline's not always the solution, maybe it's a boat. And he tracked this. It's a book called The Difference. And what we saw is the same in government. Firstly, we shouldn't get carried away that our elected representatives are experts in these topics either. You don't have a long career in Treasury and then become the Finance Minister. You don't have a long career at the bench and become the Justice Minister. Generally, you have a long career in your party and then become one of those ministers. So we don't think there's a natural, this is not a career to earn that Otherwise, we wouldn't see such reshuffles in ministries as we do. So no, absolutely, everyday people are the ones chosen, and the first thing we do is make sure that they have the capacity to ask for any expert they want to hear from. In our energy inquiry, which we ran, we saw people weighing up. There is not many solar farms in New South Wales, despite being one of the hottest places on earth. And one of the citizens asked, we don't understand how there can be solar farms outside Berlin and it snows and it is 40 degrees in Western New South Wales and we don't do anything. And all we simply asked as the process designer was, who would you trust to inform you? We get very used to, you can pay an expert to say anything. So it's not about lobby groups and advocacy groups saying, here is the report that you should read. It's just a question of saying, work out amongst yourselves who you would trust. And who they identified was actually a large renewable energy investor called Pacific Hydro. It's the largest in the country. And the energy company who simply wasn't buying the output from the farms they proposed to build. Look, yeah, as a function probably of the fact we were working for the Parliament and the organisation and who's behind us, we managed to get the chief executive of the energy investor Pacific Hydro to appear and the head of economics for AGL, the energy company, to appear via video link to both juries. What we found interesting is that both of those people commented afterwards that was a better questioning session than we normally get at the government inquiry, because people aren't loaded up to ask political questions. They just wanted to get some answers. You can't do this in a rapid fashion. You can't do this in a weekend town hall meeting. You can't do it in a direct democracy model. What we do takes 4 to 5 months, and it takes 60 plus hours in person. But in the context of major decisions, we're starting to see that it delivers more insightful and more trusted decisions. And for the cost of, in Australian terms, probably $100,000, so 80,000 euro, we can say to government, here is a solution that we can come in, turn the key. We simply have no issue position. On an energy inquiry, we don't care whether it's all wind or all coal or whether people burn wood in the backyard. We simply have no view. What we can do is facilitate and enable a group of people to come together and work it out themselves. And what we found, what they came out with, and it's all published on our website, but we found what they came out with, the politicians were saying, there are things in here we simply cannot say because we'd never get elected, but it's very, very clever. That's the difference that we think we can achieve through a process. But for it to be trustworthy, you have to be randomly selected. If it's self-selected, it's just like the current parliament without the voting. You'll still have people separated on the two sides and yelling at each other and going crazy. If you go to a randomly selected model, you will get a very different discourse in the room.
Well, I have two more questions. The first question is, there seems to be some kind of wave that is placing some movements that are using internally and externally direct democracy tools. And I speak about the 5 Stars movement in Italy. And I speak also about the Direct Democracy Party in Ireland, which was a very interesting position on the elections last week. What are we seeing today? Are we seeing the start of a wave of direct democracy and participatory democracy tools in the world?
I think what you're seeing is a rejection of the status quo. You're seeing a rejection of how we do democracy today, but I'm not sure it's a case of an informed choice amongst all the changes. I think it will be interesting to see the results. A lot of the times, and again in Australia, we criticise that we have government by opinion poll. I'm not sure if that translates, that the government looks at what an opinion poll is on the issue and responds and changes their policy. I'm not sure if that's the case in Portugal. We see direct democracy, the risk is that people will make very quick responses and you may create more problems than you solve. In a direct democracy environment, it's possible for people to say, I want more services and to pay less tax. Well, how do you solve that? Whereas we see in a deliberative environment, you simply won't get that resolution because you can allow much more nuance in the discussion. You can only really ask people a yes or no question in a direct democracy model, and there's no guarantee that anyone's read anything. So I think I look at that as less an embrace of direct democracy and more of a desire for change, that just keeping on voting for people, it's not working really well, is it?
No, it seems not. So basically, there are three ways of doing things. The current model, the representative model, there is the direct democracy model like the one implemented in Switzerland, and there is a third option named the deliberative process. No, correctly saying three ways. And you are defending the way that uses Demarchy, so far, in other things like these ones.
The sound is just dropping out a little bit for me, Rui, but I think I got your question. That no, there is, while we are willing to advocate a large number of reforms and alternatives, there are no direct democracy models that we actually advocate, because we don't see that they serve the goal of making government less adversarial and more representative. What we think is it rewards a campaigning outlook of how many people can I quickly convince to be on my side, not necessarily having thought about it. It doesn't mean that we as a group of citizens will trust the decision anymore. We'll just think, oh, they organised their group of people to get more signatures behind it. We don't think a government by petition or a government by opinion poll is won't be a particularly good place to live. So what we look at is deliberative democracy. Give random samples of people time, information and authority, and that simple formula. Start with a random group of people and don't rush them or force them or lead them, but give them a great amount of time and let them go down the path of working out what it is that they want. And if nothing else, it's worth trying, particularly with some of the tough decisions that we see. And an 80 to 100,000 euro trial, given the scale of problems faced by some European countries, look, democracies everywhere, we are seeing that as a very reasonable thing. And what we do at the foundation of New Democracy is we're in the position where a government can't absorb that we also fund and operate the trials as well. Most governments are more than happy to do that, but where for some reason it's not possible, we do get involved. So yeah, I don't mean to, I understand the push for direct democracy, and how I interpret that and how I hear that is it's a desire for innovation in democracy, and that's what we have in common. But it's quite a stark difference to say, have people had a chance to discuss it as a group and consume a lot of the information on many issues of the day. Do you believe is the bank bailout in Cyprus a good idea or a bad idea? And the most honest answer is, I don't know. I would be the wrong person to ask in a direct democracy environment. But if I was told that my decision was somehow binding and I was one of 50 people looking at it, then I've no doubt of my capacity to actually consume that information and get involved in it. But there are so many public decisions. Can we consume that information for all those issues? I don't think that's reasonable.
Let's see. Perhaps the better option is to mix everything, because we don't believe that it is possible to change suddenly from a representative model into another kind of model.
You may like, if you have the chance, you should look at the electronic town hall model. If you're looking at a more direct model, there's a very interesting piece of writing around taking a full 1/50th of the population and getting them involved.
Yes, I've read the resume on your site. It's about the virtual parliament, isn't it?
Sorry, that sound is just breaking up for me a little bit.
Okay, we are just going to the last question. How do you think that change into these new models of democracy can be implemented in our society?
I think how we achieve change is that you approach politicians, you approach your representatives with a solution rather than with a complaint. And we see many groups in Australia and certainly in North America saying our government is terrible, they're all dishonest, we want to throw them all out. Well, they're not just all going to quit one day. What we see is the chance to say if you were in the position of the politician in that, would you engage with those groups? Would you work with them? Take a different kind of starting point of saying, we understand how the system works. If you had to be the Prime Minister, you would make certain decisions, you would take certain things that benefit you electorally, you'd make sure you announce certain things, and maybe, if not hide, then you certainly wouldn't bring up bad news. Starting to approach it from that point of view of it's just a hard job, and how can we help the leaders to lead? How can we get trust behind a resolution? And it's about asking open questions. Even in the case of maybe governments that are constrained by debt and insufficient taxes, just asking a group of people, how can we raise the money we need to operate the government? Ask that open question and give a sample of people and say, if that reaches a consensus outcome, if 150 of those citizens can reach consensus around that, would you agree to table that on the floor of Parliament? Now, in our experience, I can't think of a politician who would say no to that. And what you'll find is that in opposition, 150 people picked at random looks a lot like the electorate. It looks a lot like who votes for them. And from a media point of view, it looks a lot like who buys their newspapers and who watches their television. It's a very difficult group of people to argue with because you don't know who is in there. So
it's some kind of statistical sample. It is more or less
correct. And even once you're at any number over 1 million citizens, you can start to work. Anytime you have 50 people, you actually can be very confident of the representativeness. And you look at confidence interval and confidence level, and possibly more statistics than you want to go into tonight. But we can back this up and essentially say we get used to seeing how people will vote and voting intentions, and that's done on 3,000 person surveys. It's done on 3,000 people because they want a confidence interval that matters whether it's 50.1% or 49.9%. But if you're looking for consensus, you're saying 90% of people in the room say that X should happen, then plus or minus 10% is fine. It's still vastly more than we see in our very simple majorities that we pursue today. If I told you a group of people left the room and they 100% agreed on taking a course of action, but they would say that vote could be plus or minus 10 or 15%, and still say, well, that's still a big majority of the population. And it's that reason that smaller samples can work. It's because you're seeking consensus. You're not simply hoping to get half the room plus one and say we've made a decision. We think that's a bad way of making public decisions, and that's why the statistics work in its favour.
I see. Well, Iain, I'm not going to take you more time because I know that you are starting the day there, and I'm ending my. So. I will close the session. I will thank you very much for this very interesting interview, and let's wait to have the real-time session in the 13th May, Saturday.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Rui. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, bye.
Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.